Dear students, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Manzoor Ahmed, lecturer history. Our today's topic for 11th class students of history subject is why was the history of the Australian native people left out of the history books? Let's explain the question. Dear students, we know that in the 18th century, the people from different European countries, especially from England, reached Australia. They occupied and colonized different parts of Australia. These Europeans, especially the English people, they occupied the mainland of Australia by displacing the native Australians who were already living there before the arrival of these Europeans to the lands of Australia. So before the arrival of Europeans, especially English people, to Australia, the Australian natives already lived there. And when these European natives, Europeans, especially English people, reached Australia, they reached to the different parts of Australia, and before settling in different parts of Australia, before establishing different colonies in different parts of Australia, these Europeans first displaced the native people of Australia from mainland of Australia and forced these Australians to get displaced and reach to the forests and rural areas in Australia. And while these Europeans then tried to write about the history of Australia, the European historians deliberately wrote nothing about the life of the native people in Australia who they had displaced, who they had thrown out from the marketplaces, from the mainland of Australia, and about these people who were thrown out by the who were displaced by the Europeans in Australia and thrown out to distant lands, jungle lands, forest lands. About these native people, the European historians wrote nothing. And the history books written by the European historians, European scholars, tell us nothing about the life of these native people of Australia who were displaced by the Europeans in Australia. Another question is that if Europeans reached Australia or wrote about the history of Australia, but then why deliberately the history of the native people of Australia was left out of the history books by European scholars? Let's answer the question. Dear students, history of Australian natives, history of Australian native people was deliberately left out of history books by European scholars, by Europeans, because the European powers, especially the English or the England, wanted to give Australians an impression that they had no worth mentioning past. Means that by not mentioning anything about the life of native people of Australia, the Europeans, the English people, wanted to give this impression to the native people of Australia that they had worth nothing to mention, that these native people of this Australia were so backward, there was not anything good that could be mentioned about them. Therefore, they were left out of history books. So, by not mentioning them in the history books, the European scholars wanted to give an impression that the Australian natives were backward. They did not live a progressive life. So there was nothing in their life that could be mentioned in the history books. Number one. Number two, these European powers, especially the England or the English people, glorified their own past and rejected the past of the natives of Australia. By doing so, the colonialists, means the powers, the European powers, especially England, who had come to and occupied and colonized different parts of Australia, these colonial powers wanted to give an impression, especially England wanted to give an impression to the native Australians that these colonialists, that these European powers, especially England, had come to civilize them. Means that these European scholars highlighted the greatness of the European culture, European society, and by highlighting this, by projecting their great past, by glorifying their own past, these European historians, European scholars wanted to give a feel to the Australian natives, that these Europeans had come to Australia to bring that glory of Europe to Australia, as natives by them, Australian natives by themselves were backward and had achieved no progress at all. Number 3, the Europeans, or especially the English people, totally hated the native Australians and tried to present them in all black and bad colors as much as possible. Europeans hated these native people because, especially the English people, when they reached Australia, they wanted to occupy more and more lands in Australia, and the occupation of more and more lands was only possible if they were able to displace the native people. So the native people in Australia were the big hurdle in the way of the Europeans, especially English people, to occupy more and more areas in Australia. It's for this reason that these English people, that these Europeans hated these Australian natives the most. That's why they always, even if they sometimes wrote about the life of these native people of Australia in the history books, they always try to paint them in all bad and negative colors, so that all others in world would justify the European colonization, the English colonization of different parts of the Australia. Number 4, the glorification of the past of native Australians by English people, by the European historians, by the European historians, English historians, would have made native people self-confident. Hence, it would have been difficult for colonial powers, colonial powers means the powers who occupied different parts of this Australia and colonized them and occupied them. And these colonial powers of Europe, it would have been difficult for the colonial powers, especially for England, to suppress them. Means that had these European historians tried to glorify the past of the native people, that glorification would have given them confidence, and that confidence would have enabled the native people to rise against the excesses, the exploitation of the Europeans which was done to them. And it would have been difficult for the Europeans to suppress the native Australians who had confidence in them. Thank you.